This is the DOH Home Service. We bring to you special coverage from the beaches of Normandy. 76 years ago, the largest naval invasion the world had ever witnessed occurred with Allied forces returning to France for the first time since its fall in 1940. Allied armies under General Eisenhower stormed the beaches of Normandy on June 6, 1944, marking the opening of a second front against the Third Reich. Please stay tuned for further information regarding this major milestone in the war. Since the occupation of France in 1940, the Axis expected the likelihood of a naval invasion to occur in the West. The daring raids on Saint-Nazaire and Dieppe in 1942 forced Hitler and the German High Command to begin construction of an Atlantic wall to repel any future Allied naval invasion in Western Europe. Stretching from the northernmost tips of Norway all the way to the Spanish border, the Atlantic Wall was an extensive series of fortifications made up of coastal batteries and other defensive structures. In the area around Normandy, fortifications were concentrated on the ports of Cherbourg and St. Malo, while the beaches themselves were guarded by gun emplacements, barbed wire, mines, and anti-tank obstacles. Defending the coast of Normandy were 3 German infantry divisions and a lone panzer division that was present close by at the town of Caen. 2 of the 3 infantry divisions which defended the beaches of Utah, Sword, Gold, and Juno were static divisions, which had relatively little training, lacked mobility, and were only supposed to man defensive positions in the case of an invasion. Stationed at Omaha, however, were the regular 352nd Infantry Division, which was better trained and equipped compared to the static divisions. Completing the German defenses was the 21st Panzer, stationed around Caen and would be the only armored contingent the Germans would have available in the opening days of the landings. Together, these 4 divisions would be all that stood between the Allies and the rest of the Third Reich in the West, with the direction of the war riding on the outcome of the battle. On June 5th, the night before the naval landings were scheduled to occur, Allied High Command initiated airborne operations behind the enemy lines with the primary goal of securing the flanks to the landing zones as well as capturing key objectives that would hinder the ability for the Germans to mount counterattacks following reports of the landings. Besides slowing down the German response, the paratroopers were also tasked with destroying German defensive positions to soften up the defenses for the soldiers that would land the next morning on the beaches. 3 airborne divisions with over 16,000 paratroopers would take part in this assault, with the American 82nd and 101st Airborne dropping behind Juno Beach, while the British 6th Airborne would land in the east to support the British flank. All 3 divisions were assigned with the vital role of destroying key bridges and capturing vital infrastructure that would be crucial in breaking out of the beachhead following the initial landings. Coordinating with the paratroopers at Normandy were elements of the French resistance, who aided the Allies in destroying vital machinery and infrastructure to further hamper the German response. Resistance activities on June 6 and in the following days saw widespread sabotage of the rail system around Normandy, which drastically slowed the German response once they realized D-Day was the second front of the war. Operation Neptune was the code name of the amphibious landings on Normandy that occurred on June 6, with 5 sectors of the beach being points of disembarkment for Allied troops. For this defining moment in the war, the Allies would land 7 infantry divisions ashore, supported by 1 armored division belonging to the 79th Armored, who would provide specialized armored vehicles to all 5 beaches. Finally, the 3 airborne divisions that had paradropped earlier in the day would regroup and support the outermost beaches of Utah and Sword. Prior to the troops waiting ashore, Allied forces first had to soften up the shore defenses of a bombing campaign in the early hours of June 6, followed by an early morning naval bombardment. While 2,200 Allied bombers did take off to bomb targets around the beachhead, it was largely ineffective, with few targets being damaged or destroyed. Having the bombing attack occur in the dark severely diminished accuracy, while risks of friendly fire due to the close proximity to the Allied fleets compounded the situation, with many bombs falling on empty fields deep behind the beach. The shore bombardment of the early morning was somewhat more successful, although like the bombers, the darkness diminished the accuracy and effectiveness of the attack. While the scale of the bombardment by the multitude of vessels did ensure the Germans became deaf, the relatively short time of only 40 minutes meant damage was quite minimal, with many of the defenses still intact as the first waves of infantry came ashore not long after.
soldiers, sailors, and airmen of the Allied Expeditionary Force, you are about to embark upon the great crusade toward which we have striven these many months. The eyes of the world are upon you. The hopes and prayers of liberty-loving people everywhere march with you.
Sword Beach was the easternmost beach out of the 5 landing points at Normandy, with it being closest to the strategically important town of Caen. Tasked with taking Sword Beach and Caen was the 3rd British Infantry Division, which would be assisted by elements of the 79th Armored Division, the 6th Airborne Division who were further inland, and brigades of commandos. After the early naval and air bombardment in the early hours of the morning, at 07:25, the first tanks set off for the beach consisting of the amphibious Sherman duplex drive tanks to provide armored support prior to the infantry landing on the beaches. Not long after, the infantry along with Royal Engineer armored vehicles landed ashore and began advancing off the beach, despite being under small arms and artillery fire, while engineers cleared the beach of mines and obstacles. Meanwhile, commandos that had landed on the flanks of Sword Beach moved to take strategic objectives, with British and French commandos in the east managing to take the seaside town of Westerham despite heavy resistance by the Germans. Soon afterwards, they had managed to link up with paratroopers of the 6th Airborne, who had been holding bridges over the River Orne and the Caen Canal. On the western side of Sword, commandos managed to connect with Canadian forces at Juno Beach while encountering heavy German defenses that prevented further advancement inland. The main British assault in the center achieved initial success, easily subduing the limited German defenses that existed. However, the move inland gradually became more difficult as they encountered stronger German resistance, with the situation made worse by the growing congestion on the beaches with men and equipment constantly being unloaded. The situation became more tedious as day passed by when at 1700 hours, the 21st Panzer Division launched the only counterattack on D-Day between Sword and Juno with the hopes of repelling the invasion. 2 thrusts were launched on the east and west of the Orne River, although Allied air superiority dealt severe losses to the division and forced them to retreat soon after. By the end of June 6, 28,000 soldiers managed to land on Sword Beach while only suffering less than 700 casualties. The landing was largely successful, although the main strategic objective of Caen had not yet been taken and the counterattack by the 21st Panzer caused further disruptions. Located in the center of the 5 designated beaches, Gold Beach was also assaulted by British forces on D-Day, this time being the 50th Northumbrian Infantry Division being tasked with securing the beachhead. Besides opening up the beach, the 50th was also tasked with securing the communes of Bayeux and Arromanches, whilst also linking up with American forces in the west at Omaha and the Canadians in the east at Juno. Similar to Sword, the infantry assaulting Gold would be supported by the DD tanks of the 79th Armored along with Royal Engineer vehicles. The preemptive early morning bombardment by the bombers and naval artillery succeeded in subduing many of the large coastal batteries, although a majority of the defensive fortifications remained intact. At 07:25, the first wave of British troops disembarked into their landing craft for the beaches, towards 2 sectors of the beach, King and Jake sectors. At King, choppy seas meant the tanks directly departed onto the beach rather than slightly offshore, causing initial confusion as the infantry arrived simultaneously. German defensive fire was rather heavy, although the armored support was successful in neutralizing many of the guns as the British arrived onto the beach. The advance inland was relatively slow, as many of the AVREs were stuck in the mud or taken out by mines. As the paths were opened up onto the beach, British forces started to advance on the fortified strongpoint of La Riviere, where German forces there continued to fight. Meanwhile at Jig, the uneven seas meant armored support arrived after the infantry had already landed, resulting in heavy initial fire from German fortifications. When the armored support did arrive onto the beach, many became stuck or were taken out by enemy fire. The strongpoint of Le Hamel was the primary objective for the British at Jig, with multiple attempts made to take the point, resulting in many casualties. It wasn't until late afternoon that Le Hamel was taken and British forces finally advanced inland to secure their main objectives. By the end of the day, British forces suffered 1,000 casualties at Gulf, although 25,000 managed to land on the beach, while the strategic location of Bayou was taken the next day. Located in between the beaches of Gold and Sword, Juno was the only beach not designated to be assaulted by American or British forces. Instead, the task of taking Juno was given to the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division. Aiding in the assault of Juno Beach would be ABREs belonging to the Royal Engineers, along with armored support from both the 2nd Canadian Armored Brigade and the 79th Armored Division. The primary objectives for the Canadians were to seize the road between Caen and Bayou, along with the Carpiquet airfield, and if possible, link up with British forces on both Gold and Sword Beach. With the exception of Omaha Beach, German defenses at Juno were especially strong compared to those at the other landing zones, with a greater concentration of defensive fortifications and mines. While the Allies did launch an early morning bombing run on Juno, it was largely unsuccessful, though prior to the attack, the naval bombardment and strafing runs by close air support succeeded in knocking out a few coastal batteries. The Canadians were scheduled to land at nearly the same time as the British, although poor weather at Juno delayed the landing by up to 20 minutes, giving the Germans additional time to man their defenses. Heavy seas made the initial landings uncoordinated, with many landing craft landing far away from their designated positions, and fierce German opposition resulted in many Canadians becoming casualties in the opening few minutes. Likewise, the armored support that was supposed to land ahead of the infantry was delayed, forcing the troops to advance under heavy fire against the German fortifications. Despite suffering heavy casualties from artillery and machine gun fire, the Canadians succeeded in pushing off the beach, and began clearing the beach of obstacles and establishing a beachhead to unload further supplies and manpower. By the end of the day, the Canadians succeeded in pushing farther than any other force present on D-Day, falling just short of their final objectives. The Canadians at Juno succeeded in linking up with British forces at Gold, although the counterattack by the 21st Panzer Division later in the day prevented them from also linking up with Sword Beach. Canadian losses were relatively heavy, with about 2,000 casualties, although Juno was considered largely a strategic success for the Allies due to the progress they made and were the closest to completing their objectives. Utah Beach was the westernmost beach and was one of the 2 landing points for the Americans on D-Day. Committed to the assault was the 4th Infantry Division and the 70th Tank Battalion, who would land on the beaches, while the 101st and 82nd Airborne Divisions would continue to operate inland. Prior to the naval landings, paratroopers who had been parajobbed overnight first had to destroy bridges over the Dew River, while also capturing causeways and bridges over the Meridore River, and most importantly, securing the crossroads at St. Mère-Église. For American forces at Utah, the objectives were to secure as much of the inland canals, to block off German reinforcements, and to establish a viable beachhead, with the primary goal being to isolate the major French port of Cherbourg and to capture it as quickly as possible. Like the other beaches, preparation for the amphibious assault began with a naval and air bombardment of beach fortifications. Though unlike at other beaches, it succeeded in damaging or destroying many of the German defenses at Utah. At 0630, the first wave arrived on Utah Beach. However, the landing craft were blown off course, far to the south of the designated zones due to strong currents. Despite that, the new landing zone was much more lightly defended and accessible than the planned landing zone, which allowed for a greater number of troops and supplies to disembark onto the beach. Critical to the initial success on Utah was the presence of Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt Jr., who was instrumental in establishing a beachhead and coordinating Allied assaults further inland. As Allied forces pushed further into France, they met up with elements of the 82nd and 101st Airborne, and together worked to secure the area around Utah in the event of a possible German counterattack. Combat casualties on Utah were relatively light, with about 200 casualties on the beach itself, although combined losses that included airborne and engineers numbered about 3,500. The Americans at Utah only managed to achieve a few of their D-Day objectives, although together with the Canadians at Juno, they advanced farthest inland within a single day. The name Omaha Beach has become legendary, with films such as Saving Private Ryan depicting the chaotic scene as thousands of American soldiers were gunned down the moment they stepped foot on the beach. Footage of the opening moments at Omaha Beach do not exist, as the initial waves of Americans were cut to shreds before many had the chance to find safe cover as they left their landing crafts. While multiple factors contributed to the exceedingly strong defenses at Omaha, their combined presence on D-Day created a maelstrom of death for the Americans, who had the misfortune of taking the beach. The terrain at Omaha was vastly different from the other 4 beaches, where the high steep cliffs gave the Germans an excellent defensive position, with only a few narrow choke points of which the Americans could assault from, while also allowing for overlapping fields of crossfire that covered the entire beach. Manning these defenses were also the battle-hardened veterans of the 352nd Infantry Division, who were much more capable than the static divisions defending the other beaches at Normandy. The task of assaulting Omaha Beach was given to the experienced troops of the 1st Infantry Division, who took the eastern half of the beach, while the western half was given to the untested 29th Infantry Division with support from U.S. Army Rangers. DD tanks were also committed to the attack at Omaha, and were planned to arrive prior to the first wave to weaken the German strongpoints. For the Americans at Omaha, their primary objective was to establish a beachhead and link up with forces at both Utah and Gold. Unlike the results achieved at Utah, the naval and air bombardment of Omaha had only minimal effect on the defenses due to a combination of poor weather and an inadequate number of ships. The invasion already began to unravel as soon as the DD tanks attempted to wade ashore, with a vast majority falling victim to the sea as a result of high waves and strong currents. The few that did manage to reach the beach immediately came under heavy fire from both artillery and anti-tank guns, further reducing the number of tanks the Allies had at their disposal. The infantry landings were also a disaster, with landing craft scattered throughout the area due to the ocean currents, while also coming under immense fire from the German fortifications that were barely scratched from the earlier bombardment. As the landing craft closed in on the beach, many became stuck on sandbars just offshore, forcing the infantry to disembark early by jumping into the water, whilst also wading ashore under heavy fire. With no cover between the landing craft and the shoreline, many Americans fell victim to the German artillery and machine guns, where their heavy equipment and deep water made them especially easy pickings. The lack of progress by the first wave necessitated the need of a second wave that would bring in much needed relief to the survivors that found themselves pinned on the beach. The second wave experienced much of the same difficulties as the first wave, with strong currents blowing troops away from their designated positions, while the still mostly intact German defenses continued to whittle down the number of attackers. Numerous landing craft also fell victim to the undersea mines as a result of the rising tide, which made them virtually invisible in the choppy seas. For many of the survivors of both waves, assaulting German fortifications were an obvious problem, as the majority of the heavy weapons were lost while attempting to reach the shore, while many of the specialist teams such as engineers landed in the wrong part of the beach. Soldiers took cover behind the shingle, not daring to cross the open field to reach the cliff face, and as men continued to fall around them, the situation grew increasingly desperate as morale started to falter. By 0800, small elements managed to rally together and assault the bluffs, eventually clearing the first exits off the beach. As more exits off the beach were created, infantry started pushing inland while surviving tanks knocked out the few remaining defenses that overlooked the beach. By the end of the day, only 2 pockets were established on Omaha, with the situation still remaining extremely delicate due to the German artillery continuing to bombard the beach throughout the day.
Anywhere but here!
None of the objectives of the first day were accomplished at Omaha, and it wasn't until the next day that the beach was finally secured. General Omar Bradley, who was in command of the 1st Swiss Army on D-Day, considered evacuating Omaha once he received the initial reports detailing the casualties and lack of progress, although in the end, the Americans managed to gain a foothold on the beach. By the end of the day, an estimated 2,000 to 5,000 Americans became casualties at Omaha, by far the deadliest of the 5 beaches that were assaulted on D-Day. While the Second World War was essentially over by the summer of 1944, the successful invasion of France by the Allies accelerated the end of the conflict. After years of meticulous preparation, the Normandy landings became the largest seaborne invasion in history that saw 160,000 soldiers cross the English Channel in a single day. While D-Day was a success, it was now about sacrifice where Allied casualties numbered over 10,000, with 4,400 of those never returning home alive. While this was the start of a long journey by the Allies towards defeating Hitler's Third Reich, the return of Allied forces in Western Europe was met by much jubilation as liberation from Nazi tyranny became a closer reality for many.